the reason why I created this is to help understand, for one, letting clients know, like, here is your bottlenecks, and then we need to come up with solutions on how to solve them. If I do a really bad job of explaining it, or there's something that somebody wants to look at in closer detail, just tell me to stop. And we'll take a step back. All right. This probably looks like a little bit scary, seeing it, right? Like all these ridiculous numbers all of a sudden. But I'll walk through it. It's actually not that crazy. And there's a little bit of legwork to fill it all out. But the reason why I created this is to help understand, for one, letting clients know, like, here is your bottlenecks, and then we need to come up with solutions on how to solve them. My Siri is going off. Go away. Okay, sorry. I don't know what I said that got her to go on, but essentially just figuring out, here are your bottlenecks, and then it leaves it up to us as, the strategist or the managers or whatever you want to call it, to understand, okay, here's the root cause of those bottlenecks, and how are we going to solve it, essentially. So I'll just quickly talk about each version, and then I'll get into the specifics of each. So version 1 calculates spend based on a set AOV and CPA, and I guess percent of customers. So we're going to start with a revenue goal that's given to us by the client. In this case, we're just using a blanket 10%. They want 10% growth from 2024. So that's easy to calculate. From there, step 1 is understanding what the customer breakdown needs to be. This is pretty specific to Meta, but I think it also pertains to Google. But it's figuring out, what is the benefit of a first-time customer versus a returning customer, and where should we spend our money? What should our customer allocation look like? In this case, being that their AOV is a little bit lower and their cost is a bit higher for new users, we're going to have a lower percentage of first-time customers. We always want to remember that we need the first-time customers, but depending on a client's goal at any particular time, we need to work with them on what that percentage equals out to. In this case, 30% seems reasonable, and that's actually where they've been for the last 2 years. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but so version 1 calculates spend essentially based on their CPA for new versus returning. Version 2 uses a set budget to calculate the cost required for you. So in this case, this would be, let's say a client comes to you and says, I need to increase my revenue by 10% this quarter or this year. And I also only have X number to spend extra. So then you would say, okay, well, we don't have any wiggle room on how we're going to allocate the budget. So we're going to take that at face value and we'll say, okay, we have $290,000 to spend over quarter 1. How do we break that down to become as efficient as possible and land at that revenue goal that they want? And essentially what that does is it tells us, okay, here's our cost that's actually required. And then we get to dictate what percentage of customer, each customer type that we target. So in this case, you can say they gave us that 290 spend, break that across 3 months. And then we say, okay, here's what cost we're roughly going to need to be at in order to hit that number. And so yeah, this one is a little bit more simplistic, whereas version 1, I think, allows us to tell the client and say, hey, if you want this goal in revenue, we would recommend allocating, whatever portion of our budget we think needs to be required to achieve a 30% new customer rate. We think that we can hit these static AOVs. Typically what I'm doing is I'm just taking the AOVs of the most recent time period for 2025. So here's our global AOV, here's it specific to new customers, and here is the AOV for returning customers. And the reason why that's important is because it helps to understand how much actual revenue can be generated from that specific customer type. For instance, in this case, returning customers have a $73 AOV. Okay, that's great. Multiplied by how many returning customers we're going to get, we can see approximately we'll be hitting, if everything goes to plan, $564,000 of our total $806,000 revenue from returning customers specifically. And then we get to look at what is a required cost per acquisition. Here's where I think it's the most important for us in understanding, okay, AOV is kind of what it is. You know, there's things that you can change here and there, usually on the user experience side and the actual web development side. Bundling, upselling, increasing prices if you have to, that has an effect. But for us specifically, as paid media managers, the cost required per new customer versus returning is where it's going to be incredibly important. And we actually used this for a client pretty recently and broke this all down for them and said, okay, this is the customer split that I think we need. Our AOV is a huge bottleneck. Our cost per acquisition is a huge bottleneck. How do we solve these problems for them? And that's actually what Melissa and I were just talking about, sending over basically a breakdown of how we think that we can solve each individual issue for them. AOV, for example, has, I think in their case, their AOV is directly correlated with their conversion value. And because they have a really poor conversion value, that AOV isn't necessarily the main priority. So we're focused on conversion value in that case. Whereas with returning customers, a huge lever that a client can pull is email marketing. That's going to make a massive difference in how much it's actually costing the client to acquire a returning customer. When it comes down to meta, I think that's where we can really dictate what the CPA of a new customer is. In their case, being $45, that's a 17% decrease year over year. How do we come to that? Well, that's where we need to step in and say, here's XYZ on how I think we can solve this issue. But it not only highlights, what is necessarily in our lap, but also gives the client feedback on, okay, your returning customer price or your cost is relatively high. I think you should reduce that. Here's how we would recommend going about that. And same with your AOV, and then dictating that split of customer type. So it's a little bit probably convoluted when you're looking at it for the first time, but I've found it really, really helpful. And I think clients actually understand it when they get to sit down and look at it and say, okay, this actually makes sense. I can see why you're telling me that I need to spend 71% extra this year just to achieve that 10% revenue goal. So yeah, that's my little spiel. But I wanted to talk about this kind of evolution of the MER tracker stuff that I've been dealing with specific clients on most recently. And one client came to me this last week, and their finance